Welcome to a restful night's sleep. Tonight we'll journey together, not with hurried steps, but with slow, steady breaths. Through Virginia's dense forests, across Georgia's open fields, and along quiet rivers that have witnessed countless stories history never recorded. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, feel the scent of dry grass, faded gunpowder, and the distant echo of marching drums stirring old memories. This isn't a tale of legendary generals or famous battles. It's the story of ordinary soldiers, young men who left home to face a world fiercer than any dream. They didn't just fight, they lived, ate, slept, and loved in the shadow of war. And tonight, you'll hear those quiet fragments of memory, soft as moonlight on a drum's surface. When you're ready, we'll begin where it all started, a call to enlist, a misty morning, and the pounding heart of a boy donning a gray-blue uniform for the first time. Explore Civil War history, stories of other wars, the call from afar. Are you still awake? If not, that's all right. My voice will soften like chimney smoke dissolving over an April field, and you can let your mind drift to days long gone, days far away, where a young man began a journey he barely understood. It was 1861. The drums of war echoed from the tender cornfields of Pennsylvania to the damp wharves of Charleston. Across the nation, fathers, brothers, and sons set down their plows, hammers, and books, trading them for uniforms that had yet to know the sting of gunpowder. For some, it was an adventure. For others, a duty. But for a 17-year-old boy named Elias from a small town along the Ohio River, it was the only way he could prove he was a man. Elias wasn't brave. He feared the dark, flinched at barking dogs, and had never ventured more than a day's walk from his family's farm. But on that day, when recruitment posters plastered the town's telegraph poles, when martial tunes blared from the square, he stood frozen, fists clenched, his heart pounding like a war drum. "Pa, I want to go." The words silenced the supper table. His father stared at him for a long moment before saying, "If you've made up your mind, then live in a way that honors the uniform you'll wear." Setting out, a haircut, a uniform, and a simple oath. The morning Elias left home was a spring dawn cloaked in mist. His mother packed him a slab of salt pork, a few hard biscuits, and a handkerchief embroidered with his name in blue thread. "Don't lose it," she said, her voice steady but soft. "It carries the scent of home." The train whistle shrieked, and the wheels began to turn. Elias pressed his forehead against the window, watching the meadows fade like an old dream. For the first time, he realized how vast the world was and how cold it felt, even as sunlight bathed the train car. At the training camp, he was ordered to line up for a haircut. His unruly brown hair fell to the floor like autumn leaves. Then came the uniform, a thick woolen blue coat, stiff boots that creaked with every step, a knapsack heavy as a water barrel, and a Springfield rifle he'd learned to clean as carefully as his own face. Then came the oath. Standing among hundreds of strangers, Elias repeated the solemn words, his voice trembling like morning dew. "I swear to uphold the Constitution and to serve until discharged." Some men laughed, others wept. Elias's throat felt as dry as if he'd swallowed sand. The first night, among strange breaths. As darkness fell, the camp grew quiet, save for the hoot of an owl and the crunch of boots on hard earth. Elias lay in a shared tent, his back aching from the unfamiliar wooden floor. To his left, a shoemaker from Boston snored like a sawmill. To his right, a Georgia farm boy mumbled his mother's name in his sleep. The night was colder than he'd expected. Even with a blanket, the wind slipped through every seam of the tent. Elias curled up, clutching the handkerchief his mother had given him, the only thing anchoring him to somewhere familiar. As sleep began to overtake him, he whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I'll learn to march in step. I'll learn to aim. I'll learn to live without fear." But in that moment, all he wanted was to sleep as soundly as he had as a child. First dreams, and words from an old soldier. The next morning before the sun could rise, the sergeant banged on the tent like a battle drum. "Up, boys. War doesn't wait for anyone." Elias jolted upright, hair askew, eyes still stinging. But as he stepped outside, he saw the camp glowing in the faint golden light of dawn. Men lined up, rifles on shoulders, the horizon burning red as blood. An old soldier, a veteran of frontier skirmishes, sized Elias up and clapped his shoulder. "New recruit, eh? Take it slow, kid. Bullets don't care if you're green or seasoned." Elias managed a smile and a nod, but his heart tightened. a quiet night before the storm night returned. The campfire in the yard flickered weakly. Someone strummed a guitar, playing a lonesome tune from the hills of Kentucky. Elias wrote his first letter home, his handwriting shaky, the ink smudged by the breeze. "I'm all right, Ma. I'm learning to be the man Pa believes I can be. But I miss you. I miss my bed, and the smell of your apple pie." He folded the letter and tucked it into his breast pocket. Leaning back, he closed his eyes, the wind whispering through the pines. The war was still somewhere far off. But for now, Elias was just a young man, lying under the vast American sky, breathing as softly as falling leaves. The weight of the unknown. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of drills and sweat. Elias learned to march in formation, though his boots blistered his feet. He practiced loading his rifle, fumbling with the ramrod until his fingers ached. He listened to the sergeant's bark orders, their voices sharp as bayonets. Yet, amidst the routine, there were moments of camaraderie. Around the campfire, men shared stories of home, tales of sweetheart letters, harvest festivals, and Sunday sermons. Elias, shy at first, began to speak of his own life. The Ohio River's lazy current, his sister's laughter, the way his father's hands were always stained with earth. One evening, a lanky soldier from Maine taught him how to whittle. Elias carved a crude bird from a scrap of pine, its wings uneven but hopeful. "For luck," the soldier said, tossing him another piece of wood. But beneath the laughter and lessons, a quiet dread lingered. Every man knew the war was coming closer. Rumors swirled, battles in Virginia, regiments mustering in Tennessee, ships blockading southern ports. Elias overheard the officers talking in hushed tones about the big fight that would decide it all. He didn't understand the politics, why the North and South were tearing each other apart. He only knew he'd sworn an oath, and that his family was counting on him to come home whole. A boy becomes a soldier. By the end of his first month, Elias had changed. His shoulders were broader from carrying the knapsack. His hands, once soft from farm chores, were calloused from gripping a rifle. He could march for hours without stumbling and fire a shot that hit the target more often than not. But the biggest change was in his eyes. They no longer darted nervously in the dark. They held a quiet resolve, as if he'd begun to accept that fear was just another part of the uniform. One night, as he lay in his tent, he overheard two soldiers talking outside. "Think we'll make it through this war?" one asked. The other, older, chuckled. "Some of us will. Some won't. Just keep your head down and your powder dry." Elias didn't sleep much that night. He thought of his mother's handkerchief still tucked against his chest. He thought of the farm, the river, the life he'd left behind. And he wondered for the first time if he'd ever see it again. The dawn of something greater. As the weeks turned to months, Elias's regiment prepared to move out. The camp buzzed with activity. Wagons loaded with supplies, horses saddled, letters written in haste. The men were told they'd march south toward a place called Bull Run. Elias didn't know what awaited him there. He didn't know if he'd be brave or if he'd falter. But as he stood in formation, rifle gleaming in the morning light, he felt a flicker of something new, pride. He was no longer just a boy from Ohio. He was a soldier, part of something larger than himself. And though the road ahead was shadowed, he would walk it, one step at a time. The fire died down. The guitar fell silent. Elias closed his eyes, the stars above him bright as hope. Somewhere far away, the war was waiting. But for now he slept, dreaming of home, of peace, and of the man he was becoming. Chapter 2. The Camp. Smoke, dust, and the bonds of brotherhood. Are you still there? If your eyes are growing heavy, go ahead and close them. For now, we step into the heart of a Civil War encampment, a place not of glorious deeds, but of mud, sweat, and friendships forged in the glow of campfires and the laughter of dusk. After his first days of training, Elias began to settle into the relentless rhythm of soldiering. A day passed like footsteps on a rocky dirt path, steady, unyielding, but laced with fleeting moments of human warmth. The camp sprawled across a gentle hillside, where afternoon winds whipped fiercely and thick fog settled at night. Rows of canvas tents stood in neat lines, like a flock of gray sheep awaiting orders. At the camp center, a flagpole rose from a mound of earth, where each morning a bugle's call pierced the dawn. That sound at first startled Elias awake, his heart racing faster than a drum roll. But over time, it became a familiar pulse, like the shuffle of boots, the scrape of razors on stubble, or the chatter of men calling each other by names and playful nicknames. A day in the camp. The day began before the sky lightened. A burly sergeant with a thunderous voice would bellow, "Up! Form ranks in 10 minutes. Last man washes the breakfast pans." Elias, now less green, made a point to rise early. He folded his blanket, laced his boots, and joined the line with his unit. Mornings were for drill. March in step, turn left, turn right, present arms. All synchronized like cogs in a vast machine. No one could lag, but no one could rush either. By noon, a brief rest came. Men kindled small fires to cook their meager rations, sometimes a scrap of salt pork, often bland boiled beans, and almost always the rock-hard biscuits known as hardtack. Afternoons meant target practice. On a cleared field, targets of splintered planks or broken barrels stood in rows. The crack of rifles echoed, and acrid gunpowder smoke stung the air, a sharp reminder of a war still distant but drawing near. As sunset painted the tent walls golden, the men found what respite they could in the life of a soldier: campfires and ghost stories. Each evening, the soldiers gathered around fires ringed with stones. Some played harmonicas, others sharpened knives, and many spun tales of their lives. Elias often sat with his new friends. Tom, a hulking Tennessean whose laugh made the world seem full of jokes. Jeremiah, a bookish Vermonter who'd once dreamed of the priesthood but now learned the ways of war. And Luis, a young Cuban immigrant, the unit's smallest cannoneer who'd crossed the sea with his parents. "Hey, you boys believe in ghosts?" Tom asked one night, chewing a strip of jerky. "In this camp?" Luis chuckled. "Ghosts wouldn't sleep on our straw pillows." Jeremiah, ever serious, leaned forward. "I read in the Bible, where there's war, there are souls that don't rest." Elias stayed quiet. Deep down, he felt there was truth in it. Some nights, the wind hissing through the tent flaps sounded like mournful whispers. Brotherhood in the red dust day by day, amid the smoke and rifle reports, something remarkable took root. Strangers became brothers. Elias had once thought friendship belonged to schoolyards where boys shared games, books, and dreams. But in the camp, friendship had a different scent of sweat, wet boots, and hardtack split in half. When rain fell, soldiers shared their only blanket to keep each other dry. When one fell ill, the group gave up their hot rations. And when a letter arrived from home, the men crowded around, listening in reverent silence to every handwritten word. One night, Jeremiah broke down. A letter from his mother told of his younger brother, struck with typhoid and unlikely to survive. No one spoke. Tom just rested a hand on his shoulder, and Elias offered the last biscuit from his pocket. No words were needed. Presence was enough. In moments like these, Elias understood what his father had meant. Not everyone survives a war, but brotherhood, it outlives even victory. The sounds that shaped a youth. In the camp, sound never ceased. The bugle's reveille, the clatter of mess tins, the crack of rifles, all wove into a rough symphony of the era. Elias began to cherish these sounds, the way one might miss the chime of a hometown church bell. One night, he scribbled in his journal, "No one told me war could become a habit." The men who became family. As weeks unfolded, Elias grew closer to his comrades. Tom taught him to play cards, cheating shamelessly until Elias caught on. Jeremiah shared passages from a tattered Bible, reading by firelight. Luis, with his quick hands, showed Elias how to clean a cannon barrel until it gleamed. They teased each other mercilessly. Tom called Elias farm boy for his clumsy first marches. Elias retaliated by hiding Tom's socks, leaving him to hobble barefoot in the morning chill. Yet beneath the jests lay a fierce loyalty. One rainy afternoon, Luis slipped in the mud during a drill, twisting his ankle. The sergeant ordered him to sit it out, but Luis refused, limping through the pain. That night, Elias and the others took turns carrying his gear, sharing their rations to keep his strength up. "Family doesn't leave family behind," Tom said, tossing Luis a grin. The weight of waiting. Though the camp was alive with routine, an undercurrent of tension grew. Word came of skirmishes in Missouri, of regiments clashing in the Shenandoah Valley. The men knew their time was coming. Elias felt it in the way the officers spoke in low voices, their maps spread under lantern light. He saw it in the extra ammunition crates stacked near the supply tents. The war, once a distant rumor, was creeping closer. He still didn't grasp the why of it all, the divide between North and South, the talk of states' rights or abolition. He only knew his oath, his duty, and the faces of the men beside him. A soldier's heart takes shape. By his second month, Elias was no longer the timid boy who'd boarded that train. His arms were stronger from hauling gear, his aim steadier on the range. He could march miles without complaint, even as his boots rubbed his heels raw. But the truest change was in his spirit. He no longer flinched at the sergeant's shouts or the dark corners of the tent. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, as if he'd begun to believe he could face what lay ahead. One evening, as the men sat around a dwindling fire, Jeremiah posed a question. "What do you think we're fighting for?" Tom shrugged. "To keep the country whole, I guess." Louis smirked. "For a chance to go home and eat something better than hardtack." Elias thought for a moment. "For each other," he said softly. The others nodded, and the fire crackled in the silence. Closing the day, under the camp's moonlight. At day's end, the camp softened. Murmured voices, coughs, and snores became the lullaby of collective sleep. Elias lay in his tent, staring at the canvas ceiling where moonlight filtered through the fog. The cold crept under his collar, but he felt warm knowing Tom breathed steadily beside him. Jeremiah muttered in his dreams, and Luis, as always, clutched his rifle like a teddy bear. Outside, the wind rustled the pines. An owl called into the night. Another day had passed. No battles, no medals, but something had grown in Elias. Patience, connection, and a fragile hope that if war came, he wouldn't face it alone. A glimpse of what's to come. As the camp settled into its routines, orders arrived. The regiment would soon march toward Virginia. The men didn't know when or where exactly, but the air grew heavier with anticipation. Elias wrote another letter home, his words steadier now. "Ma, I'm stronger than I was. I've got friends here who'd walk through fire for me, and I'd do the same for them. Whatever happens, I'm not scared anymore. Or at least not as much." He sealed the letter, tucked it away, and lay back under the stars. The war was out there, waiting. But for now, Elias was a soldier, bound to his brothers, ready to meet the dawn. Chapter 3. Eating and Food. Hardtack, Coffee, and the Endless Hunger Strike. Have you ever gone to bed with an empty stomach? Not because you meant to skip a meal, but because there was simply nothing to put in your belly. Close your eyes and imagine this. You've just trudged 12 miles under a scorching summer sun, your boots so worn they've rubbed your feet raw, sweat drying on your shirt in salty patches. You slump down, open your knapsack, and what do you find? A biscuit as hard as a river rock and a gulp of water that tastes like swamp grass. That was the daily reality for Elias, and it took him a long while to stomach the meager rations of a Union soldier. He'd never been fussy about food. Growing up on an Ohio farm, he ate whatever his mother set on the table, from cornbread to boiled greens. But the Army's provisions could make even the most forgiving soul grimace. Each Northern soldier was promised a standard ration, which sounded generous at first. 3/4 of a pound of salt pork or tinned beef, a handful of hardtack biscuits, coffee, sugar, vinegar, salt, and, on rare occasions, dried beans or rice. The catch? Those rare occasions were more like miracles, and the reality of what reached the men was often far less than promised. Hardtack, the brick-like biscuit you couldn't live without. Elias would carry the memory of hardtack to his grave, the stubborn companion of every soldier in the Civil War. It was a deceptively simple thing. Flour and water, mixed and baked until it was as unyielding as granite. No salt, no yeast, no trace of fat. Fired in ovens until bone dry, it could sit in a knapsack for months, even years, without a speck of mold. Taking a bite was like snapping a twig. Crack. Try it without preparation, and you might chip a tooth. Some soldiers learned that lesson with a wince and a curse. "This is no for eating," Tom would say, holding a biscuit up like a trophy. "It's for lobbing at officers to knock some sense into 'em." Elias picked up a vital trick early on. Soak the hardtack in hot coffee or boiling water until it softened into something vaguely edible. But fires weren't always possible, especially on the march, and cold water took forever to do the job. Worse, some biscuits arrived speckled with mold or crawling with weevils, little stowaways the men nicknamed bonus crackers. Elias would tap his hardtack against his tin cup, watching the critters skitter away, then shrug and eat what was left. Hunger had a way of dulling disgust. Yet in the grip of true hunger, hardtack wasn't just sustenance, it was a lifeline, a gritty miracle that kept you going when nothing else could. Coffee. The elixir of hope coffee was a rare luxury in camp, but to the soldiers, it was worth more than gold. Union troops were often issued green coffee beans, which needed roasting over a fire and grinding with whatever was at hand, a rock, a rifle butt, or a stick. The process was tedious, but every bitter sip was a treasure, a fleeting reminder of the world before the war. Elias came to love mornings when the camp was still shrouded in fog. The men would gather around a small fire, passing a battered tin canteen of coffee, its surface flecked with ash or grit. The brew was often scorched, sometimes gritty, but to Elias, it was a taste of comfort, warming him from his core to his fingertips. Luis, with his quick hands and quicker temper, once traded his entire sugar ration for a handful of coffee beans. "Without this," he said, his eyes bloodshot from a night on guard duty, "I'd collapse before the next mile." In the South, coffee was a ghost of a memory. Elias heard tales of Confederate soldiers brewing substitutes, roasted dandelion roots, charred corn kernels, even dried sweet potato peels. "It's like coffee you dream about," a captured rebel told him with a wry grin, "because it ain't real." The Northern soldiers guarded their coffee like a sacrament, rationing it carefully, savoring each sip. It wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a moment of normalcy in a world of chaos. Salt pork, tough to chew, vital to survive. Salt pork was the cornerstone of a soldier's diet, the primary source of protein. Packed in barrels and caked with salt to preserve it, it was so briny it could make your mouth pucker. Soldiers had to boil it multiple times to leach out the salt, but even then, it left them parched, reaching for their canteens with every bite. On occasion, the ration included tinned beef, a gluey, grayish mass with a smell that reminded Elias of the slop his father fed the barn cats. Yet, in the face of hunger, it was as precious as a feast. One grim day, Elias's unit received a batch of rancid meat. The stench hit them before they even opened the crates. Some men retched, others spent the night clutching their stomachs, struck with diarrhea. The sergeant, cursing under his breath, ordered the lot buried in a deep pit. That evening, Tom caught Elias's eye and muttered, "I'm so hungry, I'm dreaming of that hole like it's a Sunday roast." The memory of that night stuck with Elias, not just the hunger, but the way Tom's humor kept despair at bay. Foraging and bartering, scraping by, beyond the rations. Rations alone were never enough, so the soldiers turned to their wits to fill the gap. They scoured the countryside for wild edibles, dandelion greens, purslane, or the tender leaves of wild potatoes. Some men, with a farmer's eye, dug up stray tubers or fished in streams when the camp was near water. The bolder ones took greater risks, slipping into nearby farms under cover of darkness to steal chickens, eggs, or a jug of milk. Such acts were strictly forbidden, but an empty stomach could bend even the sternest rules. Elias never joined these raids. He was too afraid of the lash or the shame, but he couldn't deny the envy he felt when a comrade returned with a fresh egg or a wedge of cheese. Bartering with locals was safer, if less thrilling. Soldiers traded spare wool socks for sugar, postage stamps for coffee, or buttons from their coats for a loaf of bread. Some sent their meager pay home, receiving care packages in return, homemade biscuits, jars of fruit preserves, or, in rare cases, a bar of soap that smelled faintly of lavender. One chilly afternoon, Jeremiah received a parcel from his sister. Inside was a loaf of fruit bread studded with dried apples, a frayed scrap of a tablecloth, and a note in her careful hand. "Eat this, and it's like you're at our table again." Jeremiah took a slow bite, his eyes closed, as if he could taste the kitchen he'd left behind. No one spoke, but the camp seemed to hold its breath, sharing in his moment of solace. That day, Jeremiah's meal was richer than anything a soldier's pay could buy. Cooking in camp, the warmth of resourcefulness. A camp kitchen was as simple as it got, a ring of stones around a fire, with no frills or finesse. Pans were often scavenged barrel lids or flattened tin cans. Spoons were knives dulled by use. Each group of friends had a cook, usually the one least likely to burn the food or drop it in the dirt. Tom, with his knack for making something out of nothing, once concocted what he proudly called Civil War chili. It was a questionable stew of dried beans, tinned beef, and softened hardtack, simmered in a tin can until it was a warm, indistinguishable mush. It wasn't pretty, but it filled the gut and chased away the evening chill. Elias learned to stretch every scrap. He saved the water from boiling greens to make a thin soup, used coffee grounds to scrub the sour smell from his boots, and gathered hardtack crumbs to sprinkle over a meal as a makeshift dessert. Every bit mattered when hunger was a constant shadow. One rainy day, the camp was too sodden to light a fire. Elias and Luis huddled under a leaking tent, chewing raw hardtack and sipping cold, murky water. The rain drummed on the canvas, a mournful song that matched their mood. That night, Elias scratched a line in his journal. Hunger isn't the worst thing. The worst is knowing you have to make peace with it. Finding humanity in hunger. Despite the scarcity, the monotony, the gnawing want, the soldiers found ways to carve out small joys. A piece of hard candy, a stolen spoonful of molasses, or a shared bite from a friend's ration could feel like a gift from the heavens. Elias never forgot one bitter night when the tent was patched and drafty, and no one had anything but a single roasted potato, still warm from the coals. Tom broke it in two and handed Elias his half. "For warm dreams, kid," he said, his grin cutting through the cold. Elias bit into the potato, its humble sweetness outshining every meal he'd ever had. It wasn't the taste, it was the gesture, the quiet bond of men who shared everything, even their hunger. As Elias drifted to sleep, the potato's warmth lingered in his chest, a reminder that even in the leanest times, humanity could still find a way to shine. Chapter 4. Marching. Endless steps on dusty ground. Have you ever walked so long you forgot you were walking at all? Just one foot in front of the other, the world blurring into a rhythm of dust and ache. Today, let's picture a red dirt road stretching to the horizon. The sun blisters your skin, or maybe a biting wind stings your face. You carry a knapsack that feels like it's full of bricks. Your boots are fraying at the seams, and your shirt clings to you, stiff with dried sweat. Over it all, an officer's shout rings out like thunder. Forward, march. You don't keep going because the destination matters. You keep going because it's an order. In war, marching is the army's heartbeat. It's not just movement. It's a way of life, a craft, a stubborn act of survival. Elias learned this truth in the weeks after joining the camp. One morning, the order came. The regiment was to leave the familiar tents behind and march south to reinforce another unit. No one asked why. No one complained. They just tightened their bootlaces, packed their knapsacks, stuffed a few crumbling hardtack biscuits into their pockets, and stepped out. Each mile a chapter, written in dust. The march began at dawn, when the air was still cool and the ground damp with dew. Boots crunched on the dirt, a steady rhythm that felt almost hopeful in those early hours. Elias's knapsack weighed nearly 40 pounds, a crushing load for his slight frame. Inside, a wool blanket, spare underclothes, 3 days' rations, a razor, dry socks, a small journal, and a faded photograph of his mother, her face soft but stern. Slung over his shoulder was his Springfield rifle, its hard, unyielding length bruising his collarbone after just a few miles. He hadn't expected walking to be so brutal. When the sun rose, it scorched his neck and forearms, turning his skin red and raw. When rain came, his boots soaked through, squelching like sponges, his trousers caked with mud that weighed him down. When the air turned cold, the wind sliced through his wool coat, sharp as a blade against his skin. Dust was a constant enemy, swirling into his eyes, coating his tongue, and settling into every crease of his clothes. Some miles Elias didn't think at all. He just followed the boots of the man in front of him, letting the cadence, left, right, carry him forward. No words, no plans, just the act of existing, one step at a time. Brief pauses. Joy like coming home. Every few hours the column was allowed a short rest. The men collapsed by the roadside, a herd of exhausted creatures gasping for breath. Some dropped their knapsacks and fell asleep instantly, faces pressed into the coarse canvas. Others pulled out a damp rag to wipe the grime from their brows. A few, like Jeremiah, opened their journals, scribbling a line or two before the inevitable shout, "Fall in, move out." Elias and his friends learned to share what little they had. A sip from a canteen, a shriveled piece of dried apple, a pinch of tobacco from a battered tin. Tom always carried a smooth river stone he called his lucky charm. During rests, he'd tuck it under his head, grinning. "My battlefield pillow," he'd say, stretching out on the dirt. Jeremiah had a different ritual. He'd tilt his head back, staring at the sky. "The sky's the same everywhere," he said once, his voice soft and distant. Look long enough, and it starts to answer you. Elias would just close his eyes, breathing in the mingled scents of dry grass, red dust, and the sour tang of the man next to him. For a moment it was enough to feel still, to let the world stop spinning under his feet. Weather and terrain, the invisible enemy. The regiment marched through open plains, dense forests, and sloping hills. No terrain was a friend. Each one stole something. Strength, spirit, sometimes even the will to keep going. One day, they crossed a swampy lowland. Every step was a trap, boots sinking into the muck, mud creeping up to their ankles. Mosquitoes buzzed in relentless clouds, their bites leaving welts that itched for days. Elias swatted at them uselessly, his hands slick with sweat and grime. Another time, they climbed a rocky ridge for 3 hours in a freezing drizzle. Hailstones, small but sharp, pelted their caps and shoulders. Elias hunched forward, thinking, no bullets needed. The earth itself could kill us. Luis faltered once, his face pale, sweat pouring despite the cold. He stumbled and would have fallen if Elias hadn't caught him, steadying him with a hand on his arm. Just 10 more steps, Elias whispered, shielding his friend from the wind. Then we'll rest. 10 steps became 100, then 1,000. But they kept going, together. Songs to lighten the load. To dull the ache of exhaustion, the men sang. The songs were simple, folk tunes, repurposed hymns, or lyrics the soldiers made up on the spot. They weren't polished, often off-key, and rarely in rhythm, but they were a balm for weary hearts. Tom led a rousing round of When Johnny Comes Marching Home, adding his own verse. When Johnny's shoes are full of holes, he still goes marching on. The men roared with laughter, the first real joy of the day breaking through the monotony. Elias preferred to hum quietly, his mind drifting to a lullaby his mother used to sing. Sleep, my child, the moon is bright, your father's shadow crosses the yard. Now that song belonged to him, a faint light guiding him through the fog of war. It wasn't just memory, it was armor, keeping him steady when the road seemed endless. The column sang other tunes too, the battle cry of freedom, Sweet Betsy from Pike, even ribald tavern songs that made Jeremiah's ears turn pink. Singing wasn't just distraction, it was defiance, a way to tell the dust, the heat, and the war itself that they wouldn't break. Halting for the night? Sleep on hard ground. When the sun sank and the men could march no farther, the regiment stopped, by a forest's edge, at the foot of a hill, wherever the officers deemed fit. There were no tents, no beds, just the earth and the open sky. If they had dry wood, they lit fires. If not, they huddled together for warmth. Blankets became mats, coats became blankets. One night, a cold rain soaked them through. Elias lay beside Tom, his boots touching wet dirt, his arms wrapped around his rifle to keep it dry. He stared at the clouded sky, thinking of home, of a soft mattress, his mother's voice, a warm supper on the table. But exhaustion won. He drifted off, and in his dreams, he wasn't marching. He was floating, weightless, free. Each step a witness marching didn't make heroes. It left behind calloused feet, tattered boots, and souls that aged too fast. But in those countless steps, through sweat, dust, and labored breaths, soldiers became part of something larger. Not through glory or medals, but through sheer endurance. Elias couldn't recall every place he passed through. The names of towns and rivers blurred together. But he remembered the faces of the men beside him. Tom's crooked grin, Jeremiah's quiet nods, Luis's determined squint. He remembered the moments they paused to pick up a strange leaf or a smooth stone, as if nature still had something to say to them. And here's the thing. Sometimes a step doesn't lead you anywhere at all. It just keeps you from falling. As Elias marched on, he carried more than a knapsack. He carried his friends, his memories, and a growing sense of who he was becoming. The road was unforgiving, but it was also a teacher, showing him that survival wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the men who walked with you, the songs you sang, and the stubborn will to take one more step. Chapter 5: The First Battle, Cold Bullets, and the Dawn of Fear. Have you ever dreamed you stood alone in a wide, open field, fog wrapping around you like a ghostly veil when a sudden explosion rips the sky apart? Not the festive pop of fireworks, but a sound that shatters the earth itself, the raw, unforgiving roar of war. For Elias and his regiment, that sound was no dream. When orders came to march toward a rumored clash, a heavy silence fell over the men. No one spoke, but they all felt the truth settling in their bones. Whispers had slithered through the ranks. Tales of enemy troops dug in ahead, of a battle that would be brutal, of the cold reality that many would not walk away. And then that morning arrived. The air was sharp with unexpected cold, dew clinging to the brims of their wool caps. The field before them was a patchwork of brittle grass, speckled with frost that glistened faintly in the dawn. No breeze stirred, but the air was thick, pressing against Elias's chest, making each breath a labor. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Tom, his rifle trembling in his hands, its weight suddenly unbearable. His eyes flicked to the distant tree line, where dark shapes seemed to shift behind the leaves. Men, shadows, or perhaps his own fear taking form. He couldn't tell. The bugle's call, a prelude to death. Without warning, a bugle pierced the stillness. It wasn't the familiar, orderly call of reveille, but the frantic, jagged wail of a battle horn, its notes sharp and urgent, vibrating in the air. Forward, the commander's shout cracked like a whip. Elias's unit lurched into motion. His legs moved not by will but by reflex, as if some invisible thread pulled him along. He felt detached, like he was floating above the ground, his body no longer his own. The first gunshot erupted, a deafening crack that seemed to split his skull. Then came a torrent of fire, volley after volley, a relentless barrage like winter thunder rolling across a forsaken plain. The sound was everywhere, inescapable, shaking the earth beneath his feet. Panic gripped Elias, his heart hammering so fiercely he thought it might burst. He crouched low, driven by instinct, his body desperate to shrink from the chaos. Dry grass scratched his cheeks, the damp soil reeking of iron and decay. A bullet whizzed past his ear, so close he heard its high-pitched whine, like a lash slicing the air. The first shot, when fingers tremble more than hearts. Elias raised his rifle, squinting through the smoke at a distant figure, barely discernible in the haze. His hands shook violently, the barrel wobbling, his aim unsteady. He had never fired at a person. Never imagined he would. He thought of his father, who once shot a wolf to save their chickens, then sat silent for days, his eyes not proud but hollow, as if something vital had drained away. Elias could still see that look, could still feel the weight of it. His finger found the trigger. He squeezed. The rifle roared, kicking hard against his shoulder, the blast sending a cloud of acrid smoke into his face, blinding him. He didn't know if his bullet struck its mark or anyone at all. For a moment, he stood frozen, not from the noise but from the void that swallowed him afterward. He felt nothing, no pride, no terror, just an empty stillness that seemed to stretch forever. Smoke, blood, and the smell of burning. The battlefield bore no resemblance to the heroic ballads sung around campfires. There were no gallant charges, no rousing cries of forward as men surged ahead. There was only a cacophony of suffering, groans of agony, desperate shouts, the staccato of gunfire, and voices calling out names through waist-high grass and choking white smoke. Elias saw a soldier just ahead take a bullet to the stomach. The man collapsed, clutching the wound, blood seeping through his fingers, staining his wool jacket a deep, spreading crimson. His eyes were wide with shock, his mouth open in a silent scream. No one stopped to help. No one could. "Get down, Elias," Tom yelled, his voice cutting through the din. A cannon shell exploded mere yards away, hurling clods of earth and debris into the air. Dust and grit coated Elias's face, stinging his eyes, clogging his throat. His body throbbed, not from injury, but from the sheer force of the blast, a pressure that seemed to crush his ribs. He flung himself to the ground, pressing his cheek to the cold earth, his arms shielding his head. His breath came in short, frantic gasps, like a fish stranded on dry land. The air was thick with a sickening blend of odors, the sharp, metallic tang of blood, the biting, sulphurous reek of gunpowder, and a deeper, nauseating stench, charred and heavy, like burnt onions. Elias realized with a sickening lurch that it was the smell of human flesh, hiding behind a tree. When the world shrinks to a patch of dirt, Elias scrambled toward a sturdy oak, its trunk a fleeting promise of shelter. On the other side crouched Jeremiah, his face pale as ash, his hands gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. He was trembling, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with the same terror Elias felt. They didn't speak. They only met each other's gaze, a silent question passing between them. Will we survive this day? Another explosion shook the ground. A chunk of the tree above Elias splintered, bark cascading down like brittle rain. He squeezed his eyes shut, his body quaking, every muscle taut with dread. Time seemed to freeze, the world narrowing to the pounding of his pulse, the ragged sound of his breathing, and the small patch of earth beneath him. After the battle, a silence more terrifying than bullets. When the gunfire finally dwindled, there was no shout of triumph, no victory, only the fragile fact of survival. Elias opened his eyes, blinking against the haze. The ground still hummed faintly, but the chaos had receded like a tide pulling back from the shore. Smoke drifted away, revealing a field strewn with bodies, some still, some stirring, others staggering forward like specters in the mist. Soldiers wept, their sobs raw and unashamed. Others called out for friends, their voices breaking on names that went unanswered. A few knelt, hands clasped, praying through faces streaked with blood and dirt. Elias rose, his legs unsteady, his head spinning. His ears rang, a high-pitched whine like a swarm of insects. Tom approached, his left arm wrapped in a hasty bandage, blood seeping through the cloth. His face was smeared with dirt, his eyes dull. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough. Elias nodded, but the gesture felt like a lie. He knew none of them were truly all right. The fallen, nameless, wordless. The regiment was ordered to withdraw to the field's edge, where the wounded were gathered in a makeshift aid station. Elias saw Jeremiah sitting beside a gravely injured soldier. The man's face caked with blood, his eyes fixed unblinkingly on the sky, as if searching for something beyond reach. Some men lay motionless, draped with blankets. Others moaned softly, their voices frail, calling for mothers, wives, or names that would never respond. A handful of soldiers began digging graves. There were no coffins, no formal rites. Just shallow pits scraped from the earth, a few whispered words, and markers fashioned from broken wood, names scratched in hurried, uneven letters. Some had no names at all, only a cap or a belt to mark their place. Elias joined the burial detail, helping to cover a body he couldn't identify. His hands gripped the shovel tightly, his eyes fixed on the dirt, unwilling to look at the shrouded figure. A strange guilt churned in his chest. Not for anything he'd done, but for the simple, unbearable fact that he was still alive when others were not. The first true taste of war. That night, the regiment camped in a forest clearing, the trees standing like silent sentinels. No one spoke. No fires were lit. The men lay down in silence, the echoes of gunfire and screams still reverberating in their minds. Elias couldn't sleep. He opened his journal, his hand shaking so badly the words came out as jagged scrawls. "I fired a bullet today, Ma. I don't know where it went. But I know war isn't what the songs make it out to be." A cold wind slipped through the tent flaps, rustling the canvas. The moon rose, pale and ghostly, casting shadows that swayed like lost hands, reaching for something they'd never find. Elias closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to shut out the images that now lived behind his lids. The blood, the smoke, the faces of the fallen. The war was far from over, and he knew more battles waited, each one a new forge for the man he was becoming. But for now, he was alive. And in the quiet of that night, with Tom's steady breathing nearby, Jeremiah's whispered prayers, and Luis's silent presence, that was enough to hold him together. Chapter 6. War's Sleep, When a Torn Blanket is the Whole Sky. Have you ever jolted awake in the dead of night, not because of a nightmare's grip, but because the cold has seeped into your bones, numbing your hands and setting your teeth to rattling like hollow reeds? For a soldier in the Civil War, sleep, something so fundamental, so human, became a rare and precious thing, a fleeting treasure snatched in the fleeting moments between marches, battles, and the ever-present threat of death. After his first battle, Elias was no longer the naive boy who'd enlisted with dreams of glory. He was still Elias, still carried the same name, the same heart, but his sleep had changed forever. Sleep, when it came, was reluctant, arriving only after exhaustion overwhelmed his body's resistance. And when it did come, it was no gentle escape. It brought with it the ghosts of the battlefield, the sharp crack of gunfire, the crimson stain of blood, the unblinking stares of men who'd never rise again. Where soldiers sleep, no beds, only earth. There were no beds in the life of a soldier, no soft quilts, no downy pillows, no warm hearths to cradle them. A soldier slept wherever fate and orders permitted, wherever the ground was flat enough to lie down. Sometimes it was beneath a tree, its gnarled roots pressing into your spine like unforgiving fingers. Sometimes it was in a muddy ditch, water soaking through your clothes, chilling you to the core. Sometimes it was in an open field, exposed to the vast, uncaring sky, with nothing but stars to witness your rest. Elias had fallen asleep sitting up, his head lolling against the cold barrel of his rifle, his neck stiff when he woke. Once he dozed in a half-sitting, half-leaning slump against a rotting stump, the damp wood crumbling under his weight. On the worst nights, he didn't sleep at all. Just lay motionless, eyes wide, staring at the constellations as if they might hold some answer to the chaos of his world. The earth was his mattress, hard and unyielding, often damp or frozen. The wind was his blanket, sharp and relentless, and the tattered woolen blanket he carried, frayed at the edges, patched in places, smelling of sweat and smoke, was his only shield against the biting cold. It was more than a piece of cloth. It was his refuge, his fragile claim to comfort in a world that offered none. Cold, not just a feeling, but a fear. The winter of 1861 arrived early, sweeping across Virginia with a damp northern wind that cut through flesh like a bayonet. Elias curled tightly beneath his coarse, heavy blanket, a worn thing riddled with holes but more valuable to him than his rifle or his boots. It was his bulwark against the frost, his only defense against nights so cold they seemed to freeze not just the body but the soul itself. On those bitter nights, he huddled close to Tom and Jeremiah, the three of them pressed together like coals in a fading fire, sharing the faint warmth of their bodies. Their breath mingled in the air, forming a thin mist that clung to their faces, frosting their beards and eyelashes. Luis, the smallest of their group, often squeezed into the middle, his slight frame nestled between them. "I'm the key piece," he'd say through chattering teeth, forcing a grin. "I keep the heat alive." But some nights, no matter how tightly they curled their limbs or how closely they lay, the cold found its way in. It slipped through the gaps in their worn coats, numbed their fingers and toes, and dulled the spark of hope in their hearts. Some men stayed awake, shivering through the night, unable to bear the chill. Others fell ill, their bodies succumbing to fever from sleeping on damp, frozen ground. A few, too weak or too weary, never woke at all, their breath stolen by the relentless cold. Elias scribbled in his journal, his pencil shaking in his frostbitten hand. "The cold of war isn't like winter back home. At home, cold was a draft through an open window, fixed with a blanket and a fire. Here it's like you're dissolving, piece by piece." The act of writing was a struggle, the ink sluggish in the chill, but it was a way to anchor himself, to prove he was still here, still fighting to feel human. A soldier's sleep. Improvisation. Born of necessity. Soldiers were resourceful, not just in combat but in the quiet art of rest. They adapted to the absence of comfort with an ingenuity born of desperation. Without pillows, they propped their heads on knapsacks stuffed with spare clothes or folded coats, the canvas rough against their cheeks. Without proper blankets, they layered their jackets, stuffed dry straw or leaves inside their shirts for insulation, or simply endured sleepless nights, their bodies too cold to relax. Elias learned a handful of tricks to survive the freezing nights. Stuff crumpled newspaper, scavenged from supply crates, or dry leaves into your coat to trap warmth against your skin. If a fire was possible, heat a smooth stone in the coals, wrap it in a cloth, and press it to your chest before lying down, its fleeting warmth a small mercy. Pull the blanket over your head, tucking it tightly to leave only a tiny slit for air, like a burrowing animal hiding from the world. Sleep in shifts, one man keeping watch, eyes scanning the dark, while the others rested, then rotating to share the burden of vigilance. Sleep, however brief or broken, was a hard-won prize at the end of a grueling day. Even when it was cut short by a midnight bugle's blare or the sudden shout of "fall in," it was a moment of reprieve, a chance to remember what it felt like to be still. Nightmares. When war invades your dreams. When exhaustion finally dragged the body into sleep, the mind often resisted, haunted by the day's horrors. After his first battle, Elias's dreams turned dark. He saw faces smeared with blood, their eyes accusing. He heard screams that stretched into eternity, names called out with no reply. He felt hands rising from the earth, grasping at his ankles, pulling him down. Some nights he woke shouting, his breath ragged, his heart pounding as if he'd run a mile through mud. Sweat soaked his shirt, even in the cold, and he'd lie there staring into the dark, afraid to close his eyes again. Tom, stirred by one such outburst, gripped his shoulder with a steady hand. "It's all right, kid," he said, his voice weary but kind. "I see it too. Every damn night. Then the sun comes up and we're soldiers again." Jeremiah, whose faith was a quiet pillar, turned to his tattered Bible before sleep, whispering verses to himself. "It's not about peace," he confessed once, his voice low. "It's about remembering I'm still a man, not just a cog in this war." Luis had his own method. "I count backward from 100, he said, his eyes glinting with a faint smile. "Each number's a letter I'll write home someday. Keeps the dreams at bay." Elias tried everything, counting, praying, humming the lullabies his mother once sang, but the nightmares slipped through the cracks. They weren't mere dreams. They were the war itself, clawing its way into the one sanctuary he'd thought was his own. Stories before sleep, fleeting humanity, amid the fight. The most cherished nights were those when the men had a moment to gather, to kindle a small fire and share stories. Not tales of battles or bloodshed, but of home, fragile memories that held them together. One soldier spoke of his first hunt, the thrill of stalking a deer through autumn woods, the air crisp with fallen leaves. Another described his mother's beef stew, the way its aroma filled their small cabin, drawing the family to the table. Someone else, voice barely above a whisper, told of a girl in his village, her smile brighter than the summer sun. Elias shared his own memories of the creek behind his family's farm, where he and his sister splashed on hot July days, their laughter echoing off the water. He spoke of the apple tree his grandfather planted, its fruit tart but sweet, perfect for pies. He described the smell of his mother's cornbread baking on Sunday mornings, golden and crisp, a scent that meant home more than any house ever could. In the dim glow of those fires, surrounded by tattered blankets, aching limbs, and lips cracked from cold, they laughed. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, as if they all sensed that tomorrow might silence those voices forever. Tom spun a tale of stealing peaches from a neighbor's orchard, only to trip and tumble into a pig bin, emerging covered in muck to the amusement of his brothers. Luis recounted trying to impress a girl by juggling oranges, only to fumble and send them rolling across the market square. Jeremiah, usually so solemn, admitted to sneaking into a church choir just to hear a girl's voice, his cheeks flushing at the memory. Those fleeting moments were a reminder that they were more than soldiers. They were sons, brothers, dreamers, clinging to fragments of who they'd been before the war reshaped them. Sleep as an act of faith. To sleep in war was an act of faith. Faith that you'd wake to see another dawn. Faith that the sun would rise even if the world felt shrouded in darkness. Faith that, for a few stolen hours, you could be human again, not just a shadow in a uniform. Elias clutched his blanket tightly, turning his back to the wind's sharp bite. He no longer feared the cold as he once had. He'd learned to endure it, to let it become part of him, like the weight of his rifle or the ache in his feet. That night, he dreamed he was on his family's porch, wrapped in a quilt his mother had sewn, her presence beside him as she knitted in the soft glow of a lantern. Outside, a gentle rain fell, its rhythm a lullaby that soothed his weary soul. When he woke, the sensation of that quilt lingered in his palms, warm and impossibly vivid. He lay still, listening to the steady breaths of Tom, Jeremiah, and Luis nearby. The cold was there, the war was there, but so were they, his brothers in arms, his reason to keep going. Elias closed his eyes again, not expecting sleep, but daring to hope for it. His blanket, torn and thin, was his sky, his shelter, his small claim to the world. In its fragile embrace, he found the strength to face another day, to carry the war and its ghosts, and to hold fast to the man he was still becoming. Chapter 7. Letters and Love. Lines of ink stained with mud. Have you ever unfolded an old letter, its paper brittle and yellowed, the ink faded at the edges, only to feel the emotions it carries rush back as if penned yesterday? For a Civil War soldier, a letter was far more than words scratched on a page. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread stitching them to a world they'd left behind, a world they feared they might never reclaim. In the relentless grind of camp life, amid the mud, the hunger, and the ever-present shadow of death, letters were a beacon. For Elias and his comrades, they were a reason to endure, a quiet reminder that somewhere, beyond the smoke and blood, someone still held them in their heart. Each morning, after choking down a breakfast of hardtack and watery coffee, and after the sharp commands of drill echoed through the camp, the men's gazes turned to a single figure. The sergeant trudging across the grounds, a heavy leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He was the mail carrier, the most eagerly awaited man of the day, bearer of hope or heartbreak. Elias Walker. When his name cut through the morning chill, Elias's heart lurched, a sudden warmth blooming in his chest. He stepped forward, nearly tripping in his haste, and took the folded paper from the sergeant's hand. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, with gentle, curving loops, his mother's. He cradled the letter like a rare flower plucked from a barren wasteland, retreating to a quiet corner of the camp. Sitting on a weathered stump, he unfolded it with care, his fingers trembling as he traced the lines, reading each word as if it were water to a parched soul. My dear son, winter has settled over the farm. This morning, I rose early to tend the fire, and frost still clung to the windows like lace. Your father is up before dawn, chopping wood, telling me you must be strong as iron now, facing the cold. Each sentence was a hug from across the miles, a tether to home. Elias smiled, but his vision blurred, tears welling until the ink swam. He wiped his eyes with a muddy sleeve, not caring about the smudge, and read on, letting the words wrap around him like a quilt. Writing letters. When a greeting holds a universe. Writing a letter was a labor of love, fraught with obstacles. There was no fine stationery, no fountain pens, no tidy desks, only scraps of coarse paper, often torn from old ledgers or packaging, a blunt steel nib that scratched more than it wrote, and a bottle of black ink, half-dried and stubborn, that seemed to taunt their efforts. Elias wrote hunched over, his fingers stiff from cold in the flickering glow of a campfire. Mud caked his hands, the wind tugged at his paper, threatening to tear it away, and the chill made his script waver like a drunkard's path. But the words came, uneven and raw, spilling onto the page like a prayer. I'm still here, Ma, both legs still working, no wounds yet. It's cold today, colder than last winter, but I'm tougher now, I think. He chose his words carefully, veiling the war's brutal truths. He didn't write of the moans echoing from the medical tent, the shallow graves dug under a gray sky, or the hunger that gnawed at his insides like a living thing. Instead, he filled his letters with small bright fragments, a sparrow's chirp at dawn, a cloud drifting by in the shape of a cow, the way the stars seemed brighter here than at home. He knew his mother would read his letters in the stillness of their farmhouse, her fingers tracing each line before folding the paper to tuck beneath her pillow or slip between the worn pages of her Bible. He wrote to shield her from worry, to give her something to cling to, even if it was a softened version of his reality. Writing was an act of defiance, a way to prove he was still alive, still himself, despite the war's efforts to strip him bare. Each letter was a small victory, a claim to the man he hoped to remain. Love in letters, simple yet profound. Not every letter came from family. Many soldiers carried notes from sweethearts, fiancées, young wives, or even girls they'd met only fleetingly before the war called them away. These letters were treasures, often read until the creases threatened to tear, their words a balm for weary souls. Tom loved to flaunt his letters from Sarah, a girl back in Nashville. She says she misses the smell of my sweat, he'd say, grinning as he waved a creased page. Can't tell if she's sweet on me or just mocking. His laughter was a rare spark in the camp's gloom, though Elias suspected Tom read those letters more for comfort than for boasting. Jeremiah kept his fiancée's letters in his breast pocket, pressed against his heart. I read them every night, he confided, his voice barely above a whisper. Even if it's just one line, I pray for you every day. Those words, simple as they were, seemed to anchor him, a steady light in the storm of war. Elias carried his own quiet longing. For Clara, the girl from the farm next door. They'd spent summer evenings by the well, gazing at the stars, talking vaguely of someday as their hands brushed but never quite held. She hadn't written, not yet, but Elias kept her embroidered handkerchief, its delicate initials a silent promise. On still nights, when the camp was hushed, he thought of Clara, her golden hair catching the sunlight, her laugh soft as rustling leaves. In the dark of the forest, her memory was a candle's flame, small but unwavering, keeping despair at bay. He wondered if she thought of him, if she looked at the same stars, if she still dreamed of that someday. Other soldiers wore their hearts openly in their letters. One man, barely able to write, dictated a note to his wife, his voice breaking as he described a patch of wildflowers he'd passed, vowing to bring her some when he returned. Another carried a lock of his sweetheart's hair, tied with a faded ribbon, touching it like a holy relic before sleep. These tokens of love, however small, were lifelines, proof that tenderness could survive even in a world of violence. When no letter comes, a silence sharper than bullets. Not every day brought mail. The days when Elias's name went uncalled were the bleakest, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. He'd sit for hours, watching others clutch their letters, some laughing with joy, others weeping silently, a few pressing the paper to their lips as if to draw warmth from the words. His own hands remained empty, his heart sinking lower with each name that wasn't his. At first, he told himself his mother was busy, tending the farm or caring for his sister. Then he wondered if the mail wagon had been lost, delayed by muddy roads or enemy lines. By the third week without a word, darker fears crept in. Had something happened at home? Had illness struck? Or worse, had they forgotten him, their lives moving on while he was frozen in this hell? Tom noticed his quiet despair and rested a hand on his shoulder. "They ain't forgotten you, kid," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Life's just rolling along back there. A letter'll come when you're not looking for it." A week later, Elias's name was called. The letter was from his 10-year-old sister, her handwriting shaky but fierce. "Don't die, Elias. I'm waiting for you to take me fishing." He laughed, a sound so light it startled him, the first real joy he'd felt in weeks. He tucked the letter into his knapsack, next to his mother's, and felt the weight in his chest lift, if only a little. Writing for others, sharing hearts through ink. Not every soldier could read or write. Many, especially those from rural hamlets or the South, had never learned, their hands more accustomed to plows than pens. For them, a letter was a gift that required another's skill. Elias often helped, sitting cross-legged by the fire, scribbling for men who entrusted him with their most private thoughts. One evening, he wrote for Amos, an older soldier with a face like weathered leather, sending words to his wife. "My dearest, I am not got the pretty words the young bucks do, but I miss you. I miss our home. I miss your fried fish on Sundays, the way it filled the kitchen." When Elias read the letter back, Amos nodded, his eyes gleaming with unshed tears, the lines of his face softening. "That's it," he said, his voice thick. "That's me." Those moments revealed the unguarded hearts of men who seemed unbreakable by day. Their words didn't need eloquence. They were raw, honest, and that was enough to carry their love across the miles. Elias felt honored to be their voice, to help them send a piece of themselves home. Fire, ink, and the scent of home. Writing a letter was more than a task. It was a sacred act, a way to preserve humanity in a world bent on tearing it away. At night, the men gathered around dying fires, writing in reverent silence. No one mocked, no one jested. They all knew those scrawled lines, whether to a mother, a lover, or a friend, were a lifeline, keeping them tethered to something greater than the war. Elias once saw a young soldier burn a letter, his face blank as the paper curled into ash. Word had come that his sweetheart had married another. He didn't weep, didn't speak, just watched the flames consume the words he'd once cherished. Later, Elias found a charred scrap, one line still legible. "Keep yourself warm." The words lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of how war could break not just bodies but hearts. Letters as the heartbeat in the mud war hardened men, forging soft edges into unyielding stone. But letters, small, fragile, often stained with mud and sweat, kept their hearts alive, beating with hope and memory. Amid the thunder of cannons, the ache of tattered boots, the chill of half-eaten rations, and the flicker of restless sleep, a handwritten note could be a home. A single sentence, "I'm still waiting for you," could hold the weight of a roof, a hearth, a life left behind. Elias wrote every week, pouring his soul onto scraps of paper, each letter a small act of defiance against the war's relentless grind. He didn't know how many more he'd get to send, or if his words would ever reach home. But as long as the ink flowed, as long as his hands still shook with the effort, he had a reason to live, to fight, to hold fast to hope. That night, as he folded his latest letter, the firelight danced across the ink, making it shimmer like a distant star. He tucked the paper into his knapsack beside Clara's handkerchief and his mother's photograph. The war raged on, but in those lines of ink, Elias carried a piece of home, a spark no cold, no battle, no fear could ever extinguish. Chapter 8. Sickness and Silent Death. Not every bullet makes a sound. Not every death arrives in the blaze of a battlefield. Some deaths come quietly, creeping in like a persistent cough, a lingering fever, or a morning when a man simply doesn't wake. War is often pictured as a storm of cannon fire and clashing steel, a spectacle of chaos and courage. But Elias, like countless other soldiers, came to learn a harsher truth. The deadliest enemies weren't always the men across the field. They were the unseen: bacteria, flies, tainted water, and the slow grind of a body pushed beyond its limits. Water, neither clean nor safe. Clean water was a rarity in the camps. Rivers and streams nearby were often fouled by the camp itself, used for washing clothes, bathing, relieving oneself, and sometimes even as a resting place for the dead. Elias remembered the first time he drank from a stream near their encampment. The water was cloudy, with a metallic tang that clung to his tongue. The sergeant had ordered them to boil it, but firewood was scarce, and thirst often outpaced caution. The men drank, unable to wait, their parched throats overriding their better judgment. Days later, Jeremiah began to suffer. It started with stomach cramps, then diarrhea that left him weak and hollow-eyed. Soon, a fever took hold, and he lay in their tent, his lips cracked, his body trembling. Elias sat beside him, dabbing his forehead with a damp rag, the only comfort he could offer. "It's nothing," Jeremiah said, forcing a weak smile. "Just need a rest, that's all." But Elias knew better. This wasn't fatigue. It was something deeper, something that didn't forgive. Names without noise, diseases that stole lives: typhoid fever, dysentery, pneumonia, malaria, infections, lung inflammation from sleeping on damp ground, minor wounds turning gangrenous in days. These were the silent killers of the Civil War, claiming more lives than bullets or bayonets. Over 60% of the war's dead fell not to enemy fire, but to diseases that seemed trivial in a world without war. Ailments that, in a different time, might have been cured with clean water, rest, or a doctor's care. Elias had seen a tentmate, a cheerful boy named Sam, die from a simple cut on his hand. The wound, caused by a slipped knife, had seemed minor at first. But within days, it swelled, turned black, and brought a fever that burned through him. 3 days later, he was gone. There were no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, no trained physicians to stem the tide. The camp's hospital was little more than a tent, and the doctors, often overworked and undertrained, could do little but watch men slip away. Sam's death was quiet. No bugles sounded, no tears were shed aloud, just the soft rustle of wind through the tattered tents as his body was carried out. The medical tent, a place of patience, not healing. The field hospital was no sanctuary. It was a large tent, or sometimes an abandoned barn, reeking of blood, pus, and the unmistakable stench of decay. The air inside was thick, heavy with the moans of the wounded and the dying, a chorus of suffering that never ceased. Elias was assigned to assist the nurses for a few days, a duty that tested his resolve more than any march. He carried buckets of water, wiped fevered brows, emptied basins of vomit, and too often helped carry bodies to the makeshift morgue behind the tent. One morning, he would never forget. A Union soldier named Carter was brought in, his leg a sickly purple-black, gangrene spreading from a shrapnel wound. The surgeon, his face grim, declared the leg had to be amputated. There was no anesthetic, only a piece of wood for Carter to bite, a swig of whiskey to dull the edge, and a nurse to hold his arms. Carter's screams were primal, like an animal caught in a trap. His eyes rolled back, sweat poured from his brow, his body convulsing with each saw of the blade. Elias stood nearby, trembling, not from the blood pooling on the floor, but from Carter's gaze, a desperate, pleading look that seemed to beg for release, for mercy, for anything but this. That night, Elias lay awake, Carter's eyes burned into his memory. He wondered if he'd ever forget that look, or if it would haunt him as long as he lived. Burial. When death becomes routine. Death was a daily visitor in the camp. Each morning brought new losses, not from battle but from the slow, invisible war waged by disease. There were no coffins, no formal funerals. Only shallow pits dug in the earth, A scrap of wood with a name scratched in haste, and a handful of soldiers shoveling dirt in silence. Tom, who'd once been quick with a joke, grew quieter with each burial. "At first, I prayed for every man," he said one evening, his voice flat. "Now, I just shut up." Elias understood. His hands moved mechanically, scooping earth with a spade, his boots caked with mud that carried the faint, sour smell of decay. Each grave was the same, quick, unceremonious, a task to be done before the next call to march or drill. Death became familiar, a grim routine, and that familiarity terrified Elias more than any cannon's roar. It wasn't the act of dying that frightened him, it was the way it had become ordinary, a part of the rhythm of their lives. Jeremiah, the final hymn. Jeremiah's condition worsened with each passing day. The fever clung to him, unyielding, draining his strength until his body was a frail shadow of the man he'd been. His skin was pale, almost translucent, his eyes sunken, his breath shallow and uneven. One night, Elias sat beside him, holding his friend's hand, its warmth fading like a dying ember. "Do you remember nearer, my God, to thee?" Jeremiah asked, his voice a faint whisper, barely audible over the wind outside. Elias nodded, his throat tight. Jeremiah began to hum, the notes weak but steady, a thread of melody in the dark. Elias joined in, their voices soft, faltering, weaving together in a fragile harmony. They sang a verse, then fell silent. Jeremiah looked at him, his eyes glistening, a faint smile on his lips. "I won't make it home," he said, his voice calm but certain. "But you will. You have to. Tell someone. Tell them we lived, not just fought." Elias wanted to argue, to insist Jeremiah would recover, but the words wouldn't come. He only squeezed his friend's hand, nodding, promising without speaking. The next morning, Jeremiah was gone. He lay still, his face peaceful, as if he'd finally found the rest the war had denied him. Elias folded Jeremiah's small, worn Bible and placed it on his chest, its pages creased from countless readings. Then he joined the burial detail, shoveling dirt over his friend's body with hands that felt like ice and a heart that ached with a loss too deep for tears. Silence. The greatest legacy of death. After Jeremiah's death, Elias stopped writing in his journal for days. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how to capture the void left behind. He sat in the tent, staring at the empty space where Jeremiah's blanket had been. The straw still bore the imprint of his friend's body, a faint outline of a life erased. Jeremiah's journal, half filled with neat script, lay untouched, as if waiting for words that would never come. Finally, Elias picked up his pencil and wrote, "Jeremiah wasn't killed. He died, quietly, like smoke drifting away after a campfire. Death makes no sound, but it leaves a hole no one can fill." The words felt inadequate, too small for the weight of his grief, but they were all he had. Each breath a miracle war killed in countless ways, not just with bullets and blades, but with cold, with tainted water, with exhaustion, with the slow erosion of hope. Elias came to understand that surviving wasn't the same as living. And yet sometimes those who died left behind a spark of life in the memories of those who remained. That night, Elias pulled his blanket tight, whispering into the dark, "Rest, Jeremiah. You're nearer to God now, and I'll tell your story like I promised." The wind sighed through the trees, carrying his words into the night. Elias closed his eyes, not expecting sleep, but clinging to the promise he'd made. Jeremiah was gone, but his voice, his faith, his quiet strength lived on in Elias, a flame to guide him through the war's endless shadows. Chapter 9. Loss and Questioning. What are we fighting for? There comes a moment in every war, when the gunfire fades, when new grass pushes through the scars of old shell craters, when the survivors look at one another and no longer see friend or foe, just people, weary and broken, standing amid the wreckage. Elias, silent after so much loss after Jeremiah's death, Elias was no longer the same. Gone was the eager young soldier who'd once asked, "What's going to happen today?" with a spark of curiosity. Now, he moved through his days like a shadow, lining up for roll call, marching, standing watch, writing letters, each action mechanical, stripped of the hope that had once fueled him. Each time another man fell, whether to a bullet or a fever, Elias no longer asked, what was his name? He only sighed a quiet lament, another one. One morning, while standing guard along a forest path, Elias spotted a young deer stepping out from the underbrush. It was thin, its coat matted from the cold, but its eyes gleamed like polished glass, bright and alive. For a few seconds they stared at each other, the world holding its breath. Then the deer turned and vanished into the trees. In that fleeting moment, Elias felt a strange kinship, a sense that he too was a lost creature, wandering through a forest of life he could no longer comprehend. Prisoners. When the enemy becomes a mirror. One day, Elias's unit captured a small group of Confederate soldiers, 6 men, lightly wounded, their hands raised in surrender. No one shouted insults or threats, no one jeered. The prisoners were bound and seated along the camp's edge, their faces drawn with fatigue and resignation. One of them, a young Confederate barely out of his teens, caught Elias's eye. His gaze was steady, not hostile, and after a moment he spoke. "Got any tobacco?" Elias blinked, caught off guard, but rummaged in his pocket and pulled out his last pinch of tobacco, rolled in a scrap of paper. He handed it over. The young soldier nodded his thanks, lit the cigarette, and took a long drag, his eyes closing as if he'd tasted paradise. Then, almost as an afterthought, he asked, "Where are you from?" "Ohio," Elias replied, his voice low. "Georgia," the soldier said. "My folks got a place near the hills, grow peaches. It's real pretty in spring." His voice cracked, and he looked away, the words heavy with longing. Elias didn't respond, only nodded, but something shifted inside him. In that moment, there was no North, no South, no Union, no Confederacy. Just 2 young men, each tethered to a home they might never see again, each carrying a wound deeper than the ones that bled. The prisoner's name was Caleb, Elias learned later. They didn't speak again, but Caleb's words lingered, a quiet echo of shared humanity that made the war feel absurdly distant, if only for a moment. Christmas Eve. A carol beyond borders. On a December night, snow fell softly, dusting the camp in a thin veil of white. The regiment had halted in a wooded valley, and across a low hill, the Confederate camp glowed faintly with campfires. Both sides knew of each other's presence, but orders forbade fighting on this hallowed night. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of fires and the occasional rustle of wind through bare branches. Elias sat by a small blaze, his blanket pulled tight, listening to the stillness. Then, from somewhere across the hill, a voice rose, a single, clear note, carrying the familiar strains of a hymn. Silent night, holy night. The Union soldiers stirred, heads lifting. A few began to sing along, their voices hesitant at first, then growing stronger. No one gave a command, no one led the way, but one by one, voices from both camps joined, weaving together in a fragile harmony that seemed to hush the wind itself. Elias sang softly, his breath forming clouds in the cold. "Sleep in heavenly peace." For those few minutes there were no rifles, no swords, no lines drawn in blood. There was only an old carol, a reminder that they had all once been children cradled in their mother's arms, dreaming of a world without war. As the song faded, Elias felt a thought take root, delicate but unshakable. Maybe we weren't born to kill each other. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy, with a shared longing for something greater than the fight. Silent conversations, questions without answers. In the rare moments of calm when the march paused and the guns fell quiet, the men would sit together, not always speaking, just existing side by side. But sometimes questions slipped out, tentative and raw. When do you think this war will end? Do you think we'll make it out alive? Do you even know what we're fighting for? Even Tom, ever the optimist with his quick grin, grew pensive one evening. He turned to Elias, his voice low. "You think we're fighting for some grand cause, for freedom, or whatever they say?" Elias shook his head, staring into the fire. "Maybe once, but now I fight for you, for Luis, for us." Over time, the war's lofty ideals, union, liberty, justice, had faded, worn thin by the grind of death and loss. For Elias, the fight had become something simpler, more immediate. A duty to the men beside him, a promise to keep them alive, to share their burdens, to carry their stories if they fell. It wasn't about flags or speeches anymore. It was about survival, about ensuring the man next to you saw another dawn. A question without an answer. Luis, the smallest of their group, the one whose laughter had once lit up the darkest nights, was struck by a bullet during a skirmish near an abandoned village. Elias found him behind a thicket, blood soaking his chest, spreading across his torn jacket. Luis's eyes were wide, searching, his breath shallow. "I don't want to die," he whispered, his voice small, childlike. "I don't want to die." He didn't cry, didn't beg, just repeated the words like a prayer. his hands clutching Elias's sleeve. Elias held him, cradling his friend's head, whispering reassurances he didn't believe, until Luis's body grew still, his warmth fading into the cold earth. That night, Elias sat alone, staring at a sky ablaze with stars. He whispered to the dark, his voice breaking. What did he die for? The question hung unanswered, heavy as the night itself. Luis's laughter, his quick wit, his dreams of home, gone, erased in a moment, for a cause Elias could no longer name. Words that won't come. Elias tried to write to preserve Luis's memory, to make sense of the loss. But the pages of his journal stayed empty. Not for lack of words, but because no words could hold the weight of what he felt. The war had swept away all certainties, enemy, ally, right, wrong. What remained was pain, raw and relentless, and the endless repetition of loss. He thought of Jeremiah's last words, of Luis's final plea, of Caleb's talk of peach trees in spring. Each was a piece of a puzzle that no longer fit together, a story with no ending, no meaning he could grasp. The question that defines us. Have you ever asked yourself, what am I doing this for? Elias had once been a dreamer, a boy who believed in justice, in the noble causes preached in town squares and written in newspapers. Now he was a soldier, a man who stood watch, wrote letters, and counted the living after each battle, each sickness, each quiet death. But he held on to one thing. The silence needed to reflect, to question, to wonder. Not every question has an answer. But the act of asking, of daring to seek meaning in the midst of madness, is what keeps a man from becoming a beast. That night, Elias sat by the fire, his blanket draped over his shoulders. He opened his journal and wrote a single line. Luis died today. I don't know why, but I'll carry him with me until I find out. The stars above were countless, each a silent witness to the war below. Elias didn't know if he'd find the answers he sought, or if they even existed. But he knew he'd keep asking, keep carrying the weight of his friends' lives, their dreams, their losses. Because in those questions, in that stubborn refusal to let go of meaning, he remained human. And that, in the heart of war, was a victory of its own. The return, memories that never sleep. The war ended. But do you know? Not everyone comes back the same. Some battles linger, smoldering in the chest, haunting sleep long after the cannons fall silent. The scars of war aren't always visible. They live in the quiet moments, in the flicker of a memory, in the weight of a name that will never be spoken again. One day, the bugle sounds the end. Elias couldn't pinpoint the exact day the war ended. Not because he didn't care, but because it wasn't the grand moment the stories promised. There were no cheers ringing through the camp, no fireworks lighting the sky, no soldiers falling into each other's arms in triumphant embrace. It was just a morning like any other. The sergeant stepped into the tent, a crumpled paper in his hand. His voice was flat, almost weary. Armistice. Then he turned and walked away. The camp fell silent. A few men managed faint smiles, their lips trembling with relief. Others sank to the ground, as if the weight of survival had finally caught up. Some wept, their sobs muffled but raw. Elias sat by the dying fire, staring at the embers as they crumbled to ash. The war was over, but Luis wouldn't rise from the earth. Jeremiah wouldn't sing his hymns again. The cold, the hunger, the unanswered questions, they lingered, heavy as the smoke curling into the dawn. He felt no victory, only a strange emptiness, as if the world had shifted but forgotten to tell him where he fit. The journey home. No glory, no fanfare. The regiment was sent home by train, packed into dusty, rattling boxcars that creaked with every mile. The men sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with exhaustion, their eyes distant. They were returning, but they were not the same boys who'd marched off to war. Elias gazed at his reflection in the grimy train window, a gaunt, pale face, eyes sunken like moonless nights. He barely recognized himself. The boy from Ohio, full of dreams and questions, seemed like a stranger now, left behind on some bloodied field. When the train pulled into his small hometown in Ohio, no crowd waited at the station. No flowers, no flags, no outstretched arms. Elias stepped onto the platform, his knapsack slung over one shoulder, his cap clutched in his hand. The winter wind tugged at his cropped hair, sharp and familiar. As he walked the familiar dirt road toward home, he passed a few townsfolk, old neighbors, shopkeepers, faces from a life before. They nodded, offered polite smiles. One man, leaning on a cane, said, "You did well, Elias." Elias forced a faint smile, but the words felt hollow. What did doing well mean when Tom, Luis, and Jeremiah were gone? When the cost of survival was a heart weighed down by ghosts? A home changed forever. The wooden farmhouse stood as it always had, its tin roof weathered, the grapevine along the porch curling in winter's grip. When Elias reached the door, his mother opened before he could knock. No words were needed. She pulled him into a fierce embrace, her head pressed against his shoulder, her arms trembling as if trying to hold every piece of him that had survived. Her warmth, her familiar scent of flower and lavender, was both a comfort and a wound. It reminded him of all he'd carried through the war and all he'd lost. That evening, his mother served roasted chicken, a dish Elias had dreamed of during endless marches and nights of stale hardtack. The table was set with care, the plates clean, the fire crackling in the hearth. But Elias ate little. Each bite brought memories of sharing scraps with Tom, of Luis begging for an extra sip of water, of the moldy tang of hardtack that had been their sustenance. His father, a man of few words, sat across from him, his weathered hand resting briefly on Elias's shoulder. No questions, no stories. He didn't need to ask. He'd been a soldier once in a different war, and he knew the silence that followed. Restless sleep, memories that refused to fade. That first night home, Elias couldn't sleep. The bed was soft, the quilt smelled of sun-dried cotton, the room quiet save for the creak of the house settling. But his body refused to rest. Every sound, the wind whistling past the window, the groan of a floorboard, became a cannon's roar, a bugle's call, a comrade's cry. In his dreams, he was back on the battlefield, lying on damp earth, the air thick with smoke. Jeremiah called his name, his voice faint but clear. Luis laughed, his grin bright as a Georgia spring. Tom tossed his lucky stone to Elias, saying, "You're home now, kid." Elias woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver across the floor. He sat up, stumbled to the porch, and stood in the cold, breathing deeply, trying to ground himself in the present. The war was over, but his sleep still belonged to the battlefield, to the men who'd never left it. Keeping the war from repeating, months passed, and Elias began to write, not the hurried journal entries of the war, but something more deliberate. He filled a large notebook, its pages thick with the stories of what he'd seen, what he'd lived through, what he'd lost. He wrote their names: Jeremiah, who sang his final hymn with a voice like a whisper of faith; Luis, whose laughter was a spark of spring in the darkest winters; Tom, who'd carried Elias on his back after the battle at Trost Hill, grinning despite the blood on his sleeve. Each line was a candle lit in their memory, a way to keep them alive. He didn't write for justice or blame, but to ensure their stories endured. Every soldier was a story, he realized. If those stories weren't told, they'd die a second death, lost to silence. Elias wrote of the small moments, the shared coffee, the songs by the fire, the quiet promises to survive another day. He wrote of the questions that haunted him, the doubts that grew with every loss, the fleeting glimpses of humanity that had kept him going. He shared his writing with his sister, now a bright-eyed girl of 12, who listened wide-eyed as he read. "Tell me about Luis," she'd say, and Elias would smile, recounting the time Luis tried to juggle hardtack biscuits, only to drop them in the mud. Through these stories, Luis lived again, if only for a moment, quiet, but not forgotten. Elias didn't become a hero. He didn't travel the country giving speeches or waving a flag. He stayed in his small Ohio town, tending a garden, helping his parents with the farm, living a life as quiet as the fields around him. Each morning, he watered rows of vegetables, the rhythm of the work grounding him. Each evening, he reread old letters, his mother's words of love, his sister's childish pleas, and the embroidered handkerchief from Clara, still tucked in his drawer. It stitches a reminder of a someday that never came. One day, a neighbor's child, a boy no older than 7, tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Elias, does war hurt?" Elias paused, the question catching him off guard. He thought of the blood, the screams, the graves, but he also thought of the laughter, the shared blankets, the carols sung across enemy lines. "Yeah, it hurts," he said finally. "But even in the hurt, there's something beautiful, because in the worst times, you learn who you love most." The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but Elias felt a weight lift. He'd spoken a truth he hadn't realized he carried. Returning doesn't mean forgetting. Are you still awake? If not, that's all right. The story has closed, like an old book returned to its shelf, its pages worn but cherished. Elias, the soldier who walked through snow and mud, who carried questions without answers, came home. He brought no trophies, no medals, only memories, sharp and heavy, but precious all the same. Tonight, if you lie down and hear the wind whispering past your window, imagine someone far away. A man in a small Ohio town, lying on an old bed, a notebook in his hands, his eyes half closed. In his dreams, he's in a field where no shots are fired. There's only a hymn, soft and clear, and laughter carried on the breeze, the voices of Jeremiah, Luis, and Tom, forever young, forever with him. Elias sleeps, and the war sleeps with him. But in his stories, his friends live on, their names written in ink, their lives woven into the fabric of a world that must never forget. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If your eyes are closing and your mind is drifting across faded battlefields, worn boots, and whispered letters from long ago, know this: you're safe now. The war is over, and tonight, peace belongs to you. It's time to rest. Let go of the marches, the cold nights, the unanswered questions. Sleep deeply, where only the stars remain above quiet fields, and Elias, Jeremiah, Luis, and Tom still sit by the fire telling stories to the night. If this story touched something in your heart, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share so that Midnight History can bring you more forgotten dreams from the past. Until we meet again, in another night, another tale, where time itself is finally allowed to sleep.